February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima. The black volcanic sand churned beneath Private Kenji Yamada's boots as he pressed his eye to the firing slit of his reinforced concrete pillbox. For 3 days, the Americans had been dying on this beach. Machine gun fire, mortars, artillery, every weapon his unit possessed had torn into the Marines as they struggled across the terraces of volcanic ash. Hundreds lay motionless in the sand, yet still they came, wave after wave. More Marines than Yamada had ever imagined existed. He had been taught that American soldiers were soft, that they valued comfort over duty, that they would break when faced with determined resistance. But these men did not break. They kept coming. Through his narrow slit, he watched another squad of Marines advance toward his position, perhaps 40 yards away. They moved in that peculiar crouch American infantry adopted under fire. Behind them, more Marines provided covering fire. The familiar crack of M1 Garand rifles echoed across the volcanic wasteland. Yamada tightened his grip on his Nambu light machine gun. 40 yards, 35. He would wait until they were closer, make every round count. His position was impregnable. 2 feet of reinforced concrete, covered with volcanic earth. Artillery had barely scratched it. The pillbox's firing slit faced down a perfect killing zone. No Marine could approach without exposing himself to interlocking fields of fire from multiple positions. Then he saw something that made his breath catch. One of the advancing Marines carried a strange device, 2 cylindrical tanks strapped to his back. A long wand extended from the tanks, terminating in a nozzle. Yamada had never seen anything like it in training or combat. The Marine holding this device moved differently than the others, slower, more deliberately. 4 riflemen surrounded him, providing what seemed like dedicated protection. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the time, subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yamada's commanding officer, Lieutenant Tanaka, had never mentioned such a weapon. The defensive preparations on Iwo Jima had been meticulous. Every American weapon had been studied, every tactic anticipated. They knew about American rifles, machine guns, mortars, tanks, flamethrowers. Wait, flamethrowers. Yamada had heard stories from soldiers who had fought on Tarawa, terrifying weapons that shot fire. But those accounts described weapons with limited range, 10 yards, perhaps 15 at most. Nothing that could threaten a position built to withstand artillery. The Marines were now 25 yards away, still well outside the range of any flamethrower Yamada had heard described. He prepared to open fire. His finger moved to the trigger. This would be another failed American assault. More bodies on the black sand, more proof that Iwo Jima would never fall. The Marine with the strange device suddenly stopped. 20 yards from Yamada's pillbox, he raised the wand. Yamada watched, curious despite the tactical situation. The weapon was too far away, much too far. Whatever it was supposed to do, it could not possibly reach his position from that distance. Then the American squeezed the trigger, and Kenji Yamada's understanding of warfare changed forever. A jet of flame erupted from the nozzle. Not the dispersing, rapidly cooling flames he had been told American flamethrowers produced. Not the short-range weapon that forced American troops to approach within a few yards. This was something different. This was something impossible. The flame emerged as a tight, dark stream, like a liquid, like burning water shot from a hose. It travelled through the air in a coherent jet that did not dissipate, did not lose energy, did not fall short. 20 yards became 15. 15 became 10. The jet maintained its form, its intensity, its terrifying trajectory. The flame struck the concrete directly above Yamada's firing slit. Then it did something he had never imagined fire could do. It flowed. The burning substance, thick and clinging, poured down the concrete face like water over a dam, seeking openings, finding cracks, flowing toward the firing slit where Yamada stood frozen in disbelief. The substance was not gasoline. Gasoline burned in the air, consumed rapidly, turned to vapor, and dissipated. This burning liquid clung to everything it touched. It stuck to the concrete. It spread across the surface. It burned with an intensity that made the air itself shimmer. Yamada stumbled backward from the firing slit as flaming droplets began to enter the pillbox. The interior filled with heat that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. The temperature rose so quickly that breathing became painful. His skin felt as though it was being cooked even though the flames had not yet touched him. Other soldiers in the pillbox were screaming, trying to escape through the rear entrance. But the American riflemen were ready for that, covering every exit, waiting for Japanese soldiers to emerge. Yamada realized with terrible clarity that he had two choices: stay inside and burn, or run outside and be shot. His superiors had prepared him to die for the Emperor. They had trained him to resist tank attacks, artillery barrages, bayonet charges. They had shown him how American weapons worked and how to counter them. But they had never mentioned this. They had never warned him about flames that could reach 20 yards, about fire that stuck and spread and could not be extinguished, about heat so intense that concrete itself seemed to burn. The napalm. Though Yamada did not know that word, though he had no name for the substance that was killing him and his comrades, the Americans called it napalm, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids combined with gasoline to create a thickened fuel that transformed flamethrowers from short-range weapons of last resort into terrifying instruments of bunker destruction. The invention had occurred 3 years earlier, on February 14, 1942, Valentine's Day. In a laboratory at Harvard University, Professor Louis Fieser had been working on a problem for the Chemical Warfare Service. American flamethrowers were inadequate. The M1 flamethrower, first used in combat by Marines on Guadalcanal in January 1943, had proven unreliable and ineffective. It used gasoline or a mixture of gasoline and diesel fuel as its fuel source. Compressed hydrogen provided the propellant. The weapon had multiple critical failures. Range was abysmal. The M1 could project flames only 15 to 20 yards under ideal conditions, often less. The short range meant operators had to approach within 10 to 15 yards of their targets. At that distance, they became easy targets for enemy fire. The fuel burned too rapidly. Gasoline consumed itself almost immediately upon leaving the nozzle. Most of the flame's energy was expended in the air between the weapon and the target. What reached the target was dispersed, cooled, and largely ineffective. The flame tended to roll off surfaces. Instead of clinging to bunkers or flowing into openings, the burning gasoline vapor would bloom briefly and dissipate. Japanese defenders learned they could simply wait out the flame burst, then resume fighting. Worst of all, the M1 was mechanically unreliable. Its electrical ignition system failed constantly in the humid Pacific climate. Operators resorted to desperate measures to ignite their weapons. Burning paper, matchsticks, cigarette lighters, anything that might catch the fuel stream. In combat, such improvisations meant exposure, delay, and death. The weapon that was supposed to save American lives by neutralizing Japanese fortifications was instead getting its operators killed while achieving minimal tactical results. The Chemical Warfare Service needed a solution urgently. Professor Fieser approached the problem methodically. The core issue was the fuel itself. Gasoline was too volatile, too light, too quick to vaporize and burn. What was needed was a thickening agent, something that would turn liquid gasoline into a gel that could be projected further, burn longer, and stick to targets. Fieser experimented with various compounds. Rubber had been tried but was scarce and difficult to obtain. Other thickening agents proved unstable or dangerous to handle. Then Fieser synthesized aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids. These two acids, when combined in proper proportion, created a powder that could be mixed with gasoline to produce a gel-like substance. The powder was remarkably simple to use. Add it to gasoline, stir, wait for the mixture to gel. The result was a fuel that behaved like liquid when under pressure, but maintained viscosity when released. Fieser combined the first syllables of the two acids' names, naphthenic, palmitic, napalm. The invention was prosaic in its chemistry, but revolutionary in its implications. This thickened fuel would change how wars were fought, how cities were destroyed, how human beings died in fire. But in February 1942, FISA was simply trying to solve a technical problem for the military. The first field tests demonstrated napalm's potential immediately. When projected through a flamethrower nozzle, napalm left the barrel as a tight, coherent stream. Not a dispersing cloud of burning vapor, but a jet of flaming gel that maintained its form across distances. The range increased dramatically. The M1 flamethrower, modified to handle napalm's higher viscosity and pressure requirements, could now project flames up to 50 yards, 3 times its original range. This modification, standardized as the M1A1 in June 1943, represented a quantum leap in flamethrower effectiveness. 50 yards, that single specification changed the tactical calculus of Pacific Island warfare. Japanese defenders had built their fortifications with specific range assumptions. Machine gun positions were sited to cover approaches. Bunkers were constructed with fields of fire calculated to maximum rifle range. Interlocking defensive positions were designed so that if Americans got close to one bunker, they would be exposed to fire from others. All of these defensive calculations assumed American flamethrowers had a maximum effective range of 15 to 20 yards. Japanese military intelligence had studied captured American weapons. They had interrogated prisoners. They had observed combat operations. Their assessments of American flamethrower capabilities were based on solid evidence. The M1 flamethrower with gasoline fuel had an effective range of 15 to 20 yards. This was documented fact. This was the information that flowed down through Japanese command structures to the soldiers building bunkers on Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Build your bunkers so that Americans cannot approach within 20 yards without exposing themselves to crossfire. Position your machine guns to create killing zones that extend well beyond 20-yard range. Construct your defenses to be impervious to anything that can reach you from that distance. Make the Americans come close. Make them pay for every yard. These were sound defensive principles based on accurate intelligence. But that intelligence was out of date. By the time Marines landed on Tarawa in November 1943, the M1A1 with napalm was already in limited use. By mid-1944, napalm had become standard. By February 1945 at Iwo Jima, every Marine flamethrower operator was using napalm-thickened fuel. Japanese defenders had no idea. The intelligence did not reach them. The updated threat assessments were not communicated, or perhaps the information was simply not believed. How could American flamethrowers suddenly triple their range? How could fire behave like water, flowing and clinging instead of dissipating? The Japanese military had its own flamethrower technology, the Type 93, introduced in 1933, and the Type 100, introduced in 1940. Both models were based on European designs observed during World War I. Both used gasoline mixed with tar as fuel. Both had similar limitations to the American M1, range of approximately 25 to 30 meters under ideal conditions, often less in combat. The Japanese understood flamethrower technology. They knew its capabilities and limitations. They had used it themselves in China, in the Dutch East Indies, in the Philippines during the early stages of the war. When Japanese military planners assessed American flamethrower threat, they did so through the lens of their own technology and their intelligence on early American models. Nothing in their experience suggested that flamethrowers could suddenly achieve 50-yard range with fuel that stuck like glue and burned for extended periods. It was outside the realm of what they considered possible, so they built their bunkers accordingly. Reinforced concrete structures designed to withstand artillery, firing slits positioned to cover approaches down to 15 or 20 yards. Interconnected positions providing mutual support. Underground tunnels allowing movement between defensive points, all planned around the assumption that Americans would have to approach very close to use flamethrowers. The assumption was reasonable. It was based on good intelligence. It reflected current understanding of flamethrower technology, and it was catastrophically wrong. On Iwo Jima, the disconnect between Japanese assumptions and American capabilities produced a systematic slaughter of Japanese defenders. Marine flamethrower operators, supported by riflemen providing covering fire, could approach Japanese bunkers to 30 or 40 yards distance. Still, well outside the range, Japanese defenders expected. From these distances, the operators would unleash napalm. The flame jets would arc across the black volcanic sand, maintaining coherence and intensity across distances that Japanese soldiers thought were safe. The napalm would strike concrete bunkers, flow across surfaces, seek openings, penetrate firing slits and ventilation shafts. Inside the bunkers, Japanese soldiers would face impossible choices. The heat alone could kill. Napalm burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In enclosed spaces, the temperature would rise so rapidly that air became unbreathable. Oxygen was consumed by the flames. Carbon monoxide and other toxic gases accumulated. Men who were not directly touched by fire would suffocate or succumb to heat prostration. Those who tried to escape through rear exits would emerge into pre-targeted kill zones where Marine riflemen waited. Those who stayed inside would die from fire, heat, or asphyxiation. There was no tactical solution, no counter-tactic that could address the fundamental problem that American flamethrowers could kill you from distances you thought were safe. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese soldiers had been trained to expect death. The Bushido Code, the warrior ethos that pervaded imperial Japanese military culture, emphasized honor in death, duty to the emperor, and steadfast resistance regardless of cost. Japanese soldiers did not fear dying. But napalm introduced something different, a type of death that was not quick or honorable, fire that stuck to skin and burned through flesh, heat that cooked men inside their fortifications, suffocation in sealed bunkers as oxygen was consumed. Post-war interviews with Japanese prisoners revealed that flamethrowers were feared more than any other American weapon, more than artillery, more than naval bombardment, more than tanks or aircraft. The terror was not just about the physical agony of burning, it was about the helplessness. A soldier could fight back against rifles, machine guns, even tanks, could take cover from artillery, could hide from aircraft, but napalm could reach into sealed bunkers, could flow around corners, could pursue you into spaces where you thought you were safe, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. The Marine Corps recognized the flamethrower's tactical value. The original Marine Division structure in the early Pacific campaigns included 24 flamethrowers, all assigned to the Divisional Engineer Battalion. By 1944, the revised Marine Division structure included 243 flamethrowers distributed throughout the entire division. Each Marine regiment was assigned 81 flamethrowers. This represented a 10-fold increase in flamethrower deployment in just 2 years. The tactical doctrine evolved to maximize the weapon's effectiveness. Assault groups were formed combining flamethrower operators, demolition men, and Browning automatic rifle gunners. This technique was sometimes called corkscrew and blowtorch. The bar gunners and riflemen would suppress enemy positions with heavy automatic fire. This kept Japanese defenders pinned down, unable to effectively return fire. The flamethrower operator would advance under this covering fire, approaching to within effective range. Then, the blowtorch. The operator would direct the napalm jet across and through enemy emplacements. The thick burning gel would flow into firing slits, ventilation openings, any crack or gap in the fortifications. After the flamethrower neutralized the position, demolition men would move forward with satchel charges or explosives. These would be used to permanently destroy the bunker, collapsing tunnels and sealing cave entrances. The technique was brutally effective. It was also brutally costly for the flamethrower operators. Despite the increased range napalm provided, flamethrower duty remained extraordinarily dangerous. The operators carried 70 pounds of flammable fuel and compressed gas on their backs. The distinctive shape of the backpack-mounted tanks made them instantly recognizable on the battlefield. Japanese snipers and machine gunners would prioritize flamethrower operators as targets. If the fuel tanks were hit by bullets or shrapnel, the results could be catastrophic. The bright flames, when the weapon was fired, created a beacon that drew enemy fire. Even from 50 yards away, the stream of fire pointed directly back to the operator's position. The cumbersome nature of the equipment meant operators moved slowly, reducing their ability to take cover or evade fire. The weapon's burn time was limited, 7 to 10 seconds of continuous fire. Then the tanks were empty. The operator had to return to friendly lines, reload with fresh tanks, and return to the fight. Each trip forward and back represented additional exposure. Combat reports from the Pacific campaigns documented that the average life expectancy of a Marine flamethrower operator in combat was approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes from the moment they began their approach to an enemy position until they were killed or wounded. Some lasted longer through skill, luck, or both. Many lasted far less. The casualty rate among flamethrower operators was so high that Marine divisions constantly needed replacement operators. Training programs were expanded. More men were taught the weapon's operation. But no amount of training could fully prepare someone for the experience of walking toward enemy bunkers with 70 pounds of napalm strapped to their back while enemy fire concentrated on them specifically. Yet volunteers kept stepping forward. Men who understood the odds, who knew that taking up the flamethrower meant accepting a very high probability of death. They did it because the weapon was essential, because without flamethrowers, assaulting Japanese fortifications meant repeated frontal attacks, massive casualties, and battles that dragged on for weeks. The flamethrower could reduce a bunker in minutes that might otherwise cost dozens of lives over days of fighting. On Iwo Jima, the flamethrower's importance reached its peak. The island had been transformed into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months preparing Iwo Jima's defenses. 11 miles of interconnected tunnels carved into volcanic rock, hundreds of reinforced concrete bunkers and pillboxes, artillery positions hidden in caves, machine gun nests concealed in rocky outcroppings. The entire island was a fortress designed to maximize American casualties. Kuribayashi understood that Japan could not win the battle for Iwo Jima. American naval and air superiority was overwhelming, but he could make the Americans pay such a high price that their will to continue the war might weaken. Every day the Marines could be delayed, every 100 additional American casualties. These were victories in Kuribayashi's strategic calculation. His defensive plan was brilliant in its simplicity. No banzai charges, no wasteful counterattacks. Japanese soldiers would fight from prepared positions. They would hold until killed. They would make the Americans dig them out bunker by bunker, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel. And the Americans would have no choice but to do exactly that, because Iwo Jima's airfields were essential for the planned invasion of Japan. The Marines landed on February 19, 1945. They immediately encountered the nightmare Kuribayashi had prepared. The pre-invasion naval bombardment had barely scratched the Japanese defenses. Shells had cratered the surface, but the bunkers and tunnels remained intact. As Marines advanced across the volcanic ash terraces, they walked into interlocking fields of fire from positions they could not even see. Casualties were immediate and heavy. Traditional infantry tactics failed. Rifle fire was ineffective against concrete bunkers. Grenades could not reach positions set back in caves. Artillery and naval gunfire had proven insufficient during the preparatory bombardment. Tanks were essential but could not enter many of the ravines and rocky areas where Japanese positions were concentrated. The flamethrower became the critical weapon, the weapon that could actually neutralize Japanese fortifications. 8 M4A3 Sherman tanks modified with Navy Mark I flamethrowers landed on Iwo Jima on the first day. These were not the man-portable M2 flamethrowers. These were vehicle-mounted systems with vastly greater fuel capacity, longer range, and armor protection. The modifications had been developed by Navy Seabees working with the Chemical Warfare Service. The CBH-1 system operated at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. This gave it a range of 400 feet. The napalm jet could reach across distances that made Japanese defenders think they were safe. The flame tanks were nicknamed Zippos after the popular cigarette lighter. The name became both affectionate and literal. These tanks could light up Japanese positions like striking a lighter. They carried approximately 2,000 gallons of fuel, vastly more than the 5 gallons in a man-portable unit. The flamethrower was mounted where the tank's 75mm main gun would normally be, so the weapon could traverse and elevate like regular tank armament. The 8 Zippo tanks were held in reserve on the first day of fighting. Marine commanders were still assessing the tactical situation. Traditional weapons were being employed first. It was not until the second day that the flame tanks were committed to action. The results were immediate and dramatic. One Zippo tank could neutralize multiple Japanese bunkers in minutes. The 400-foot range meant the tanks could engage positions from distances where return fire was ineffective against the Sherman's armor. The massive fuel capacity meant sustained operations without constant refueling. Japanese soldiers began abandoning positions they had been ordered to defend to the death. This was unprecedented. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers had fought with fanatical determination, preferring death to surrender, holding positions until killed. But the flame tanks broke something in the Japanese defensive psychology. There was no honor in being burned alive in a sealed bunker, no tactical purpose in dying from heat and asphyxiation while your position contributed nothing to the defense. The primitive, primal fear of fire overcame training and ideology. Word spread through Marine units. The flame tanks worked. They could take out positions that had stopped infantry attacks cold. Marine assaults began to wait for flame tank support before proceeding. If a strongpoint was holding up an advance, the call would go out for a Zippo. The tank would approach, unleash its terrible fire, and the position would be neutralized. Captain Frank Caldwell, a company commander with the 26th Marines, would later state unequivocally about the flame tanks. In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. The flame tanks consumed napalm at a staggering rate. Each Zippo carried enough fuel for multiple engagements, but the intensity of fighting on Iwo Jima meant constant resupply was necessary. The tanks burned through approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm every single day of the battle. 10,000 gallons. Every day. For 36 days of continuous combat. The logistics of this consumption were extraordinary. Napalm had to be manufactured, stored, transported to the front lines, and pumped into the tanks under combat conditions. The Chemical Warfare Service's 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company had developed stabilized napalm formulations specifically for mechanized flamethrowers. In June 1944, they had overseen construction of an activating plant that produced over 250,000 gallons of the thickened fuel. The Iwo Jima operation consumed 200,000 gallons of that production, nearly the entire output of months of manufacturing work, expended in just over a month of fighting on an island measuring 8 square miles. But the expenditure was justified by results. Without the flame tanks, Iwo Jima would have cost even more American lives, taken even longer to secure, and might have failed entirely. The Japanese defenders knew they were facing something they had not been prepared for. Survivors later described the psychological impact. The sound of the flame tanks approaching, the distinctive roar of the Sherman's engine, the knowledge that your fortification, your carefully prepared defensive position, the concrete and volcanic rock that had protected you from artillery and naval bombardment, would be useless against what was coming. Some Japanese soldiers attempted to destroy the flame tanks through suicide attacks. Small groups would emerge from concealed positions, carrying magnetic mines or satchel charges, attempting to reach the tanks and disable them. These attacks were almost always fatal for the attackers and rarely successful against the well-armored Shermans. Marine infantry providing security for the flame tanks would cut down the attackers before they could close the distance. The desperation of these suicide attacks revealed how much the Japanese feared the flamethrowers. Soldiers who had been willing to die defending their positions now chose to die attempting to destroy the weapon that made those positions untenable. It was a tactical shift born of terror and futility. Better to die trying to stop the flames than to die burning in your bunker. For the Marine flamethrower operators carrying the man-portable M2 units, the situation was only marginally better than for the flame tank crews and infinitely more dangerous. They did not have armor, protection. They could not engage from 400 feet. They had to approach to 30 or 40 yards, close enough that enemy fire was accurate and deadly. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams became one of the most celebrated flamethrower operators at Iwo Jima. On February 23, 1945, 4 days into the battle, Marines were trying to advance across one of the airfields. Japanese pillboxes had stopped the advance cold. Casualties were mounting. Traditional infantry tactics were failing. The flame tanks were engaged elsewhere or could not reach the positions due to terrain. Williams volunteered to assault the positions with his flamethrower. He was the only flamethrower operator remaining in his battalion. The others had been killed or wounded. 4 riflemen accompanied him to provide covering fire. For 4 hours, Williams moved between Japanese positions. He would approach a pillbox, unleash napalm into firing slits and ventilation openings, then withdraw to reload. The riflemen kept Japanese soldiers pinned down while Williams worked. On one occasion, he climbed on top of a pillbox to insert his flamethrower's nozzle directly through an air vent. The napalm poured straight down into the fortification. The occupants died instantly. The position fell silent. Williams moved to the next target. 4 hours of continuous combat. Multiple trips back to American lines to obtain fresh flamethrowers and prepare demolition charges. Japanese small arms fire concentrated on him throughout. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Bullets struck the volcanic rock around his feet. Shrapnel from grenades buzzed past. The bulky flamethrower tanks on his back made him an obvious target, but Williams survived. His actions that day neutralized 7 Japanese pillboxes and enabled the Marine advance to continue. He would be awarded the Medal of Keifer, honor. The citation would describe his actions as demonstrating valiant devotion to duty. But Williams himself would later reflect on the men who had covered him during those 4 hours. 2 of the 4 riflemen he had selected were killed in action during the operation. When Williams learned this, the meaning of his Medal of Honor changed for him. He stated publicly that the medal did not belong to him. It belonged to the men who had died covering his advance. He wore it in their honor, kept it polished for them, because there is no greater sacrifice than when someone sacrifices their life for you. This became a common refrain among flamethrower operators who survived. The guilt of survival, the knowledge that others had died protecting them while they wielded the terrible weapon, the understanding that every successful flamethrower assault came at the cost of riflemen and support troops who drew enemy fire away from the operator. Of the 27 Medals of Honor awarded at Iwo Jima, 12 were for actions involving the elimination of enemy fortifications with flamethrowers, demolitions, or supporting fire for such operations. 12 out of 27, nearly half. This statistic reveals how central bunker-busting operations were to the battle. Only 6 of those 12 recipients survived Iwo Jima to receive their medals in person. The other 6 were posthumous awards. The casualty rates among flamethrower operators and their support teams were astronomical. One Marine battalion's portable flamethrower unit sustained a 92% casualty rate during the battle. 92%. Nearly every man trained to use the weapon was killed or wounded. Yet the flamethrowers remained essential because nothing else could neutralize Japanese fortifications efficiently enough to keep the advance moving. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. It was the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, only about 216 were captured alive. Most were captured because they had been knocked unconscious or were physically unable to resist. Thousands more continued resisting in isolated cave systems for weeks after organized resistance ended. American casualties totaled over 26,000, with nearly 7,000 killed in action. The bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. A battle where progress was measured in yards and every yard cost lives. But Iwo Jima had to be taken. Its airfields were essential for supporting B-29 bombing raids against Japan. Fighter escorts could now accompany bombers all the way to Japanese targets. Damaged bombers returning from raids could make emergency landings on Iwo Jima rather than ditching in the ocean. The strategic value justified the terrible cost, but that justification came later, in staff reports and strategic assessments. On that volcanic rock, there was only the immediate tactical reality. Japanese bunkers had to be eliminated. Flamethrowers could eliminate them. Someone had to carry the flamethrower. The innovation of napalm had transformed what was possible. The thickened fuel had turned flamethrowers from short-range weapons of dubious reliability into decisive tactical tools. The 50-yard range of man-portable units and the 400-foot range of tank-mounted systems meant Japanese defensive calculations based on earlier flamethrower technology were obsolete. But obsolescence killed slowly in military organizations. Information moved through intelligence channels at speeds determined by bureaucracy, translation, verification, and distribution. Even when Japanese military intelligence officers learned about napalm and improved American flamethrower capabilities, that information had to reach combat units, had to be incorporated into defensive planning, had to change how bunkers were sited and constructed. In the chaos of 1944 and 45, as American forces advanced across the Pacific and Japanese defensive positions became increasingly isolated, that information flow broke down. Units preparing defenses on Tarawa in late 1943 had no knowledge of napalm because napalm had only recently been standardized. Units on Saipan in mid-1944 might have heard rumors, but lacked detailed specifications. By Peleliu in September 1944 and Iwo Jima in February 1945, napalm was standard equipment for American forces, but Japanese defenders still built their fortifications based on outdated flamethrower range estimates. This intelligence failure was not due to Japanese incompetence. It was the natural result of fighting a war across vast ocean distances while losing control of the sea and air. Japanese ships could not safely deliver intelligence reports. Radio communications could be intercepted. Officers who knew about American napalm capabilities could not easily travel to forward positions to update defensive doctrines. The result was a systematic knowledge gap. Japanese soldiers defending Pacific islands did not know that American flamethrowers could now reach them from distances they considered safe. They did not understand that napalm burned differently than gasoline, clinging to surfaces and flowing into openings. They were not prepared for the psychological and physical effects of being attacked by a weapon more terrifying than anything in their training or experience. This knowledge gap killed thousands of Japanese soldiers, not because they lacked courage or determination, not because their defensive positions were poorly designed or inadequately constructed, but because they built those positions based on threat assessments that were several years out of date. Their bunkers could withstand artillery. Their pillboxes had excellent fields of fire. Their tunnel systems allowed safe movement between positions. All of these defensive measures were sound against the threats they anticipated. But against napalm delivered from ranges exceeding their defensive calculations, these fortifications became death traps. Sealed concrete boxes where heat accumulated, tunnels that channeled burning gel toward troops trying to escape, cave systems where oxygen was consumed by fire, leaving only toxic gases and unbearable heat. The irony was profound. Japanese military planners had studied World War I trench warfare extensively. They understood the value of fortifications. They knew how to construct positions that could absorb tremendous punishment. Their defensive engineering on islands like Iwo Jima represented sophisticated military planning. but sophistication based on incorrect assumptions about enemy capabilities produces only sophisticated failure. The Americans, meanwhile, had invested heavily in solving the bunker problem. The Chemical Warfare Service had recognized early that Pacific Island warfare would require specialized weapons for reducing fortifications. Napalm was developed specifically to address the inadequacies of existing flamethrowers. The modifications to create the M1A1 and later the M2 flamethrower were driven by combat reports from the field. The flame tanks represented an even greater investment. Converting Sherman tanks into flamethrowing vehicles required specialized equipment, trained crews, substantial fuel logistics, and tactical doctrines for employment. The Navy Seabees, who designed and built the CBH-1 and CBH-2 systems, worked under tremendous time pressure to have the weapons ready for Iwo Jima. The Chemical Warfare Service personnel, who trained the 713th Tank Battalion to operate flame tanks, did so knowing that the weapons might make the difference between victory and defeat. This systematic American approach to problem-solving through technology and logistics contrasted sharply with Japanese, a defensive doctrine that relied on courage, determination, and fortifications built to withstand conventional weapons. Both approaches had merit within their respective strategic contexts, but in the specific tactical environment of Pacific Island warfare in 1945, the American approach proved devastatingly superior. The knowledge gap between what Japanese defenders expected and what American flamethrowers could deliver was not unique to Iwo Jima. Similar patterns appeared across multiple Pacific campaigns. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese defenders were shocked by flamethrower effectiveness against their cave complexes. On Okinawa from April to June 1945, the 713th Tank Battalion, now fully converted to flame tanks, burned through 200,000 gallons of napalm supporting both Army and Marine Corps operations. Every battle revealed the same pattern. Japanese defensive positions built around outdated threat assessments, American flamethrower operations that could engage from unexpected ranges with unprecedented effectiveness. Japanese casualties from heat, fire, and asphyxiation. The tactical advantage was so pronounced that it raised questions about the ethics of such weapons. Newspapers in America began describing flamethrowers as barbarous and inhumane. The nature of flame weapons generated controversy that traditional explosives and bullets somehow escaped. The Chemical Warfare Service attempted to address these concerns through a propaganda campaign that seems darkly absurd in retrospect. In 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Orby Bostick wrote an article titled "Mercy Killer: Instant Death from the Flamethrower." The article appeared in the Chemical Warfare Bulletin and argued that flamethrowers caused instant death with far less pain and suffering than bullets or explosives. The article included photographs and first-hand accounts describing what were portrayed as quick, painless deaths. The claim was that flame attacks produced such profound shock to the nervous system that victims died instantly without suffering. This characterization was based on incomplete understanding and wishful thinking. Later medical studies would reveal that flamethrower deaths were often protracted and agonizing. Burns, heat prostration, carbon monoxide poisoning, and asphyxiation all caused significant suffering before death occurred. The mercy killer narrative was propaganda designed to make American soldiers and public more comfortable with the weapon's use, not an accurate medical assessment. But the ethical questions, however important, did not change tactical realities. Flamethrowers worked. They neutralized Japanese fortifications efficiently. They saved American lives by reducing the need for frontal assaults on prepared positions. Military commanders prioritized effectiveness over ethical concerns, and soldiers on the ground prioritized survival over philosophical debates. For the Japanese soldiers who faced these weapons, the ethical questions were irrelevant. They understood only that they were dying in ways they had not anticipated, from weapons that could reach them from impossible distances, delivering fire that stuck and burned and could not be fought or escaped. The terror was existential. The helplessness was complete. The weapon that American propaganda called a mercy killer was the weapon Japanese survivors most feared and most desperately wanted to destroy. After the war, when American forces occupied Japan and the Japanese military was disbanded, captured equipment included Japanese flamethrowers. The Type 93 and Type 100 models were examined by American technical intelligence units. The examination revealed flamethrowers roughly equivalent to early American models. Similar range limitations, similar fuel systems using gasoline or gasoline tar mixtures. No evidence that Japanese designers had developed anything comparable to napalm. The Japanese military had fielded flamethrowers since 1933. They had used them in China, in Southeast Asia, in the early Pacific campaigns. They understood the weapon's utility. But they had not invested in the research and development that would have produced improved fuel formulations or extended range systems. Perhaps because Japanese strategic planning prioritized offensive operations where flamethrowers had limited utility compared to rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Perhaps because chemical warfare research focused on other areas. Perhaps because the resources required for such development were unavailable in a nation fighting a multi-front war with dwindling industrial capacity. Whatever the reasons, the result was a technological gap. American forces had flamethrowers that could project napalm 50 yards from man-portable units and 400 feet from tank mounts. Japanese forces had flamethrowers with 20 to 30 meter maximum range using conventional fuels. American forces had invested in the logistics to deliver hundreds of thousands of gallons of specialized fuel to forward combat zones. Japanese forces used whatever fuel was locally available. This technological gap was one of many that characterized the Pacific War's final years. American industrial capacity, scientific research, and military logistics combined to produce weapons and capabilities that Japanese forces could not match. The flamethrower gap was simply more visceral, more immediately terrifying than gaps in aircraft production or naval tonnage. Fire has always held special horror for humans. Our primal fear of burning makes flamethrowers uniquely disturbing weapons even compared to explosives that might kill more efficiently. When Private Kenji Yamada huddled in his pillbox on Iwo Jima, watching napalm flow down the concrete toward his position, he was not contemplating technological gaps or strategic implications. He was experiencing raw terror. The weapon attacking him was impossible according to everything he had been taught. Flamethrowers could not reach 20 yards. Fire could not behave like liquid. American weapons could not penetrate his fortifications. Yet the impossible was happening. The flames were reaching him. The heat was rising. His breathing was becoming labored. His skin was blistering from radiant heat, even though the fire had not yet touched him. The tactical situation he had been prepared for, trained for, accepted as the circumstances of his death, had been replaced by something unexpected and infinitely worse. He had been willing to die fighting. He was not prepared to die burning. No one is ever prepared for that. Yamada did what thousands of other Japanese soldiers did in similar circumstances. He ran, out the rear entrance of the pillbox, into the open air, toward anything that was not the heat and fire consuming his position. American riflemen were waiting. They had covered every likely exit. They knew what would happen when napalm entered sealed fortifications. They knew men would run. Yamada made it perhaps 5 steps before rifle fire cut him down. He died on the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, killed by bullets rather than fire, one of approximately 18,000 Japanese soldiers who would die defending the island. His death was tactically meaningless, strategically insignificant, and personally devastating to a family in Japan who would never know the specific circumstances of how their son died, only that he died doing his duty for the emperor. But Yamada's death, and the deaths of thousands like him, represented more than individual tragedies. They represented a systematic failure of military intelligence and a tactical innovation that changed warfare. The flamethrower with napalm demonstrated that even small technological improvements could have disproportionate tactical impacts. A thickening agent that cost pennies per gallon transformed an inadequate weapon into a devastating one. The 50-yard range increase meant Japanese defensive positions designed around 20-yard assumptions became killing zones for their own defenders. The Americans continued refining flamethrower technology through the war's end. Plans for the invasion of Japan included massive deployment of flame tanks. The 713th Tank Battalion had 70 flame tanks ready by August 1945 when Japan surrendered. Orders had been placed for additional conversions. The Chemical Warfare Service was developing new napalm formulations with even better performance characteristics. Had the invasion of Japan occurred, American forces would have deployed flamethrowers on a scale exceeding even Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese home islands' defenses included extensive fortifications, cave systems, and prepared positions. American planners anticipated that reducing these defenses would require systematic use of flame weapons. The casualties would have been staggering on both sides, but the Americans believed flamethrowers would provide the tactical edge necessary for victory. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before that invasion occurred. The flame tanks waiting in Hawaii were never used in combat. The napalm stockpiles were never expended against Japanese home defenses. The planned systematic burning of Japanese fortifications never happened, but the capability had been developed, the logistics had been prepared, the tactics had been refined through brutal experience on island after island. In August 1945, 2 white-painted G4M Betty bombers, marked with green crosses, departed at Sugi Airfield carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms. The same type of bomber that had opened the Pacific War by attacking Clark Field in the Philippines now carried Japan's surrender delegation. The symbolism was lost on no one. The aircraft that had represented Japanese offensive power now represented Japanese defeat. When the surrender documents were signed aboard USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the war officially ended. American forces occupied Japan. Japanese soldiers returned home. The terrible weapons of the Pacific War were mothballed or scrapped. Flamethrowers remained in American arsenals through Korea and Vietnam, but were eventually phased out. The Department of Defense stopped using them in 1978. Modern combat doctrine considered them of questionable effectiveness against contemporary threats. But for the men who fought in the Pacific from 1943 to 1945, the flamethrower remained the weapon that changed island warfare. The weapon that could neutralize fortifications other weapons could not touch. The weapon that Japanese defenders feared above all others. The weapon whose capabilities exceeded what any defender expected or could effectively counter. The story of napalm and flamethrowers in the Pacific is ultimately a story about knowledge gaps and their consequences. Japanese military intelligence assessed American flamethrower capabilities based on the weapons they encountered and the technology they understood. Those assessments were accurate when made but became rapidly obsolete as American research produced napalm. The information about this new threat reached some Japanese units but not others. Defensive positions built in 1943 based on flamethrower threat assessments from 1942 faced weapons in 1945 that could reach them from impossible distances with impossible effectiveness. The soldiers who built those positions, who defended them, who died in them, did everything their training and doctrine required. They constructed sound fortifications based on accurate intelligence that had become obsolete. They fought with courage and determination against a threat they did not understand until it was too late. They experienced something no military training can prepare anyone for, the sudden realization that your fundamental assumptions about the battlefield are wrong, and that the wrongness will kill you. Private Kenji Yamada, huddled in his pillbox, watching flames flow toward him from distances he thought were safe, experienced that terrible realization. So did thousands of other Japanese soldiers across dozens of Pacific islands. They did not know that American chemists had invented napalm. They did not know that American flamethrowers now had triple the range of earlier models. They did not know that fire could be made to behave like liquid, clinging and flowing and seeking openings. They learned these things in the worst possible way, in the final moments of their lives when knowledge could no longer help them. The Americans who wielded these weapons knew their capabilities precisely. They had been trained on the equipment. They understood napalm's properties. They knew the effective range was 50 yards for portable units and 400 feet for tank mounts. They knew the fuel would stick and burn and flow into sealed spaces. But many of them died anyway, because knowledge of your weapon's capabilities does not make you invulnerable to enemy fire. The flamethrower operators who approached Japanese positions knew they were carrying 70 pounds of explosive fuel, knew they were priority targets, knew their life expectancy was measured in minutes. They advanced anyway because the mission required it, because their fellow Marines needed those bunkers neutralized, because someone had to do it and they had volunteered or been assigned. The Japanese soldiers who defended those bunkers knew they were supposed to die at their posts, knew that surrender was not an option, knew that their deaths would serve the emperor and the nation. They held their positions until the impossible flames reached them and made holding any longer synonymous with death by burning. Two groups of soldiers, trained by different nations, following different doctrines, armed with different weapons, meeting in combat where technological advantage determined who lived and who died more surely than courage or determination ever could. The Marines, with their napalm flamethrowers, had a tool that Japanese defenders could not effectively counter. That advantage was purchased through years of research, millions of dollars of investment, and systematic industrial production of specialized fuels. But the advantage was also purchased through the lives of flamethrower operators who died bringing that weapon to bear, and through the lives of riflemen who covered those operators, and through the lives of Marines who advanced behind the flamethrowers into positions that had been neutralized at terrible cost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.